Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second day afternoon sessions of the DMHA Cultural and Linguistic Competency Conference for 2022. Our presentation this afternoon, our first presentation, will be the structure of belonging in therapeutic groups. I will introduce to you Anna Schoen from the Northwest Indiana Community Action and Beth Ellen Holloman from the Hive Collective. Anna Schoen has over 25 years of leadership experience in a variety of human service settings. Since 2006, Anna has been working at Northwest Indiana Community Action, based in Crown Point, Indiana, where she currently serves as the Vice President of Planning and Business Development. In her role, Anna leads the organization's community needs assessment process, develops outcome-oriented strategies for change, and leads the organization's efforts to measure and document success. Anne is a certified community action professional and a certified trainer in results-oriented management and accountability through the National Peer-to-Peer Training Network. Anne has also helped lead the effort to establish an annual conference addressing the intersection of trauma and adverse childhood experiences and community development in Northwest Indiana in 2019. Anna is particularly interested in placemaking and belonging as strategies to advance equity and inclusion. Beth Ellen leads with the belief that purpose-driven organizations will achieve their aspirations when boards, fundraising, and operations are transparent, respectful, empathetic, and courageous. She is a lead consultant with the Hive Collective, which is a growing consortium of thought leaders and practitioners who apply the concept of connective and inclusive board governance. For over 6 years, Beth Ellen led Together Women Rise, a powerful community of women and allies dedicated to achieving global gender equality. Beth Ellen is a certified fundraising executive and board source governance consultant. And Beth Ellen strives to dismantle systems of oppression in all of her work, recognizing that often the systems under which nonprofits function were not created by the people who participate in them. Beth Ellen strives to give space for the creation of inclusive structures guided by self-determination, dignity, and respect. She recognizes that the unearned privileges that come with her identities may cause her to miss valuable perspectives in decision-making or advice, and she invites feedback and conversation when she expresses privilege in any way and endeavors to learn, reflect, and continue to change. Please stay for our Q&A afterwards with Anna and Beth Ellen once the presentation is over. And finally, remember that there is a networking cafe available through our CLC conference this year. This is an in-conference learning session that includes a TED Talk library. And this is your last chance to access the cafe live. The library features TED Talks from our speakers from the CLC conference, and PDFs of these slides that we are about to see can also be found there. The TED Talks are approximately 20 minutes long, which will be a great use of your break time between this and our next session. So Anna and Beth Ellen, I now turn things over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. Welcome, everyone. I'm Beth Ellen, and as Kristen introduced, we have Anna Schoen with us. We are excited to be here to talk about the structure of belonging and how it can be implemented within groups within your organization. And we can go to the next slide, and Anna is going to talk about why belonging is so important.
So, hello, I'm excited to be here with you this afternoon. I've been studying belonging for several years, and I'm convinced that creating spaces where belonging can happen is a way to overcome much of the anxiety and pain and divisiveness we are witnessing these days. And there's plenty of evidence to support this idea. I love this definition of belonging from Brené Brown that says, true belonging is the spiritual practice of believing in and belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share your most authentic self with the world and find sacredness in both being a part of something and standing alone in the wilderness. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are, It requires you to be who you are. And so over the course of my study and working with organizations to build belonging, one thing that I've come to know is that we can create a structure or a container that makes this kind of belonging to ourselves possible. But it requires us to be really intentional about creating the conditions where this can happen. And so during this session, Beth Ellen and I are going to propose a new way of gathering together that can convert isolation within our organizations and our communities into connectedness and caring for the whole. We'll talk about several like the mechanics of doing that, but we're going to start talking a little bit about the evidence base that supports this work that we're doing. When we set about creating this structure for belonging, we have to shift our focus from a focus on problems that we want to solve to a focus on possibilities that we want to create. And so we bring people together and we engage them in a specific kind of conversation that gains commitment to create a new kind of future that cares for the good of the whole organization or community. So To Belong has two meanings. The first is to be related to or be a part of something, right? I belong to a group. But the second is to be an owner of something. Something belongs to me. And so to belong to an organization is to act as a creator and owner of that organization. I build and nurture what belongs to me. So our work then in our organizations is to create this wider, deeper sense of ownership to foster among all of the community's members or the organization's members a sense of ownership and accountability. Many organizational cultures value things like speed and convenience and individuality and independence. These values create isolation and competition. So our challenge in creating a place that works for everyone is to overcome these kinds of cultural forces. And so we need to design ways of coming together that become an example of the kind of future we want to create. So the basis for the model that we're proposing comes from a variety of disciplines. And I'm going to share a few of those foundations, and then Beth Ellen's going to share a few. The first that we talk about is from Christopher Alexander, who's an architect, who speaks of the quality of aliveness that he tries to bring into the buildings that he builds. But that quality of aliveness is a core tenet of this work of building belonging. So whatever work we're doing together, whatever problem we're trying to solve, we want to infuse it with this quality of aliveness. And for this quality to exist in whatever final product or solution we create, it has to exist in each step of the process that we engage in. So at every single step, we need to be asking whether this step in our work holds this quality of life and intensity. So creating belonging in organizations is really about bringing aliveness and wholeness to our understandings of leadership, participation, organizational structures, and context. And as we pursue this quality of aliveness, what we want to create together unfolds or emerges organically. So this requires seeing each small detail as equally important to whatever issue we're trying to address. How we gather, how we occupy a room, how we organize the interaction matter as much as the solution we're pursuing. So in this process, we build each of the qualities we hope for in the final product into each step. We create an alternative future in the room so that it exists in the world right now today. So Peter Kostenbaum is a philosopher who sort of builds on this work, and he talks about choosing freedom and accountability. And freedom for our purposes is defined, sorry, I lost my place there. Let me get back to it real quick. Freedom for our purposes is defined as the choice to be a creator of your own experience and to accept the responsibility that goes with that choice. So it begs the question whether the real task of leadership is really to confront people with their own freedom. From choosing our freedom comes the willingness to choose to be accountable. Freedom is what creates accountability. Our willingness to care for the well-being of the whole arises when we're confronted with our freedom and we choose to accept and act on that freedom. Another person that we draw from in this model of creating belonging is David Bornstein, who is a journalist who wrote about Grameen Bank in Bangladesh and other social innovations that have become kind of large movements. And within the stories he tells in his books, he shares some radical thoughts about how successful transformations come into being. Not one of the examples that he uses began as a government or large system-sponsored program. Each was begun with very little funding, no fanfare, little concern about how to measure the outcomes. Bornstein concluded that well-funded efforts with clear outcomes that spell out the steps to get there don't actually work. Changes that begin on a large scale are initiated or imposed from the top and are driven to produce quick wins, inevitably produce few lasting results. And then the last person that I'll share about is Alan Cohen, who distinguishes between emergent strategies or destination or blueprint strategies. So he suggests that a good place to begin in an organization is to ask why the organization has not been moving naturally in a more desirable direction. Then take modest steps to impact the conversations and relationships that are shaping that direction. And then watch what happens, take another modest step, reevaluate, and so on. So the strategy emerges. So Beth Ellen's going to pick up the evidence base here and then take us on a little bit.
Well, more about the structure of belonging and one of the things that we do when we're looking at problems, whether it's in our personal lives or organizations or communities, we look at deficits first. And this is sort of a medical model that ignores the abundance of gifts that we can bring. And John McKnight challenges us to look at gifts. He says that creating community means first understanding the depth and breadth of the potential in people surrounding you. And this idea has been come to be known as asset-based community development. Study the assets, resources, and talents in a community. And John McKnight also points out that the words professionalized care are oxymoronic. People are often well serviced in a medical model, but you often have to ask what has fundamentally changed in their lives. And an alternative system is when people voluntarily come together. Think of how the disabilities movement has led to greater visibility and citizens coming together to embrace people with disabilities in their neighborhoods. And sustainable transformation happens when individuals, not institutions or experts, come together to produce a desired future. And then we want to look at Werner Erhard, who said that in language, we must shift the conversations, we must shift to conversations that we haven't had before. And this is where we have the power to create something new. We need to question who we are in the world and what we have valued. And I like to look at the anonymous movement here. Some of the rules that are different from our normal lives, if you go to an AA meeting or something of the sort, when you use rules that are different from our normal lives, it gives space for transformation. So for example, no crosstalk. That's not a normal way for us to converse, but it gives space for a person to fully think and hear themselves. Also, anonymity. This isn't a rule that we normally have in our everyday lives, but it gives an opportunity to bring your true self and transform your worldview. So again, this is shifting to conversations that we haven't had before. We also want to look at bonding with each other. We often look at how we approach groups looking inward, and then there is the idea of bridging to look beyond our circles of connection. And both types of this social capital are important for the community or the organization or a group. But if you're only focusing on bonding, that perpetuates segregation. So I used to lead one of the largest giving circles in the country. So, and it was with 500 chapters, and each of those chapters were very committed to each other. But we also understood that the reasons that the chapter were not diverse or as diverse as we wanted them to be was because it's easier to bond with each other than it is to bridge. And human nature leads us towards what is easy. So we focus more on bonding. And so making sure that as a part of the structure of belonging, we're focusing on bonding and bridging is really important. And Sunny, we're going to go to the next slide now. So this is the, we want to think, whoops, go back to the tool, the context for restorative community. There we go, thank you. So think of the news you read this morning, fear and blame. We need new policies. Think of politicians always trying to problem solve. Think of how we approach our organizations and our family. We're always problem solving. But what that does, if we're only focusing on this paradigm, we are focusing on blame and self-interest and obligation, and really looking to hold someone else accountable other than ourselves. And we need to think about how we bring people into our organizations and groups so that we have a community context of possibility and generosity. So we want to create a community where people have accountability, that people are choosing to be accountable for themselves, because we really can't hold other people accountable, right? People can only hold themselves accountable. We want people to be in a community where their willingness to connect with others is, they have the choice to do that, and they can exercise their own power. And we want people to be able to make promises to each other in a way that holds themselves accountable. And so that is the future possibility of a community context. And that's what we want to create through the structure of belonging. Next slide.
There we go. Sorry about that. So we're going to talk a little bit more now about the actual tools and the way we create this structure. So the tools that we use to create this new context include the invitation, the order of assembly, and the questions that we use. Transformation happens by choice, right? Like we can't mandate people to change. Because it happens by choice, that means it has to be initiated through an invitation. So the invitation is a call to create an alternative future. Refusal is a perfectly acceptable response to an invitation, right? So the invitation has to allow room for people to say no. If no is not an option, then it's not an invitation. The invitation also contains a hurdle or a demand if it's accepted. It's a challenge to engage. Lots of our leadership initiatives or trainings are about how we get other people to do the things we want them to do, right? But people need to self-enroll, and Beth Ellen was mentioning this a little bit, in order to experience their own freedom of choice and commitment to whatever initiative you're undertaking. So we specify the requirements and tell them explicitly what's going to be required if they choose to attend. There's a price that's paid when they decide to attend. They'll be asked to explore ways to deepen their learning and commitment. They'll be asked to postpone problem solving and the negotiation of interests. And they'll be asked to talk intimately with people they don't know, people that they may have a story about. So the invitation, the form of the invitation also matters, right? So the more personal it is, the better. This is how we create that quality of aliveness. A visit or a personal in-person invitation is more personal than a phone call. A phone call is more personal than a letter. A letter is more personal than an email. And so how we invite people and how we invite people to this kind of new kind of restorative community matters. And then once they've accepted the invitation, the way that we assemble matters as well. So we want to create each meeting to be an example of the kind of future we want to create. So if we are envisioning this possibility of this organization that has this quality of aliveness and there's kind of energy buzzing and people are connected to each other and interested in each other and caring for the whole organization, we need to build that in the room at each meeting that we're holding. And so when we do that, then this meeting becomes the future that we're creating, right? And so we've already built it in this room. It already exists in the world. So the room becomes the visible expression of the kind of belonging we plan to create. And so we want space that supports belonging. Lots of meeting spaces are designed for control or negotiation or persuasion, but community is built, belonging is built when we sit in circles. And we like circles without tables the best. So if people can just be in circles with no kind of barrier between them. Also helpful if there are windows and signs of life in the room. And then also we want every voice to be equally heard and amplified. So if there's a mic, the mic goes to anyone who's speaking. So we're all sitting on one level, so it's all equal. And then we interact in small groups. So even a large group meeting uses small groups to create connection and move the action forward. The small group is the structure that allows every voice to be heard and allows everything to be said, even though not everyone is hearing it or not everyone is saying it. And then each meeting begins with connection. This is more than just an icebreaker, right? Icebreakers are fun, but they don't necessarily build connection between people. So icebreakers help us make contact. contact with each other, but not build connection with each other. So some examples of connection questions we might use are: what led you to accept the invitation to be here today? What would it take for you to be present in this room? What is the price someone else paid for you to be here today? These kinds of questions invite people to begin bringing their whole authentic self into this space. And then the third tool that I mentioned are questions. We use powerful questions to build belonging and community. The conditions that we want to create that invite commitment and accountability use these kinds of powerful questions. We believe that questions are more transformative than answers, and they're the essential tools of engagement. They're the means by which we get confronted with our freedom. And so in this sense, if you want to change an organizational culture, you find a powerful question. Questions open up conversations, answers close down conversations. And so a great question has some elements. And we review these every time we do one of these meetings. So the questions are intentionally ambiguous. We don't try to precisely define what we mean by the question. That requires each person to bring their own personal meaning into the room. Powerful questions are personal. Everything that we're passionate about, everything that we're committed to and connected to grows out of what's personal to us, right? And so we create space for people to bring what's personal to them into the room as well. And then they evoke anxiety. Beth Ellen doesn't like to call it anxiety, but that is the quality that we're looking for in a question, right? When things matter to us, they make us a little bit anxious, right? And so it's our wish to escape from anxiety that steals our aliveness. So if there's no edge to the question, if it doesn't make us a little bit nervous, it's really not a powerful question. Then we give permission for unpopular answers to these powerful questions. So when we pose a question, people tend to want to figure out the right answer, right? So if I ask you, what commitment are you willing to make? You're searching for words that equal a commitment that you're willing to make, right? But we give permission for people to say, I'm not willing to make a commitment at this moment, because we care more about their authenticity than their actual answer to the question, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but we want people to own their experience, not necessarily ensure that the experience is a good one, right? So they can choose to have a poor experience as long as they're aware that they're choosing that. And then we avoid advice. So we naturally tend to want to fix things for people and solve problems for people and advise them about how to fix whatever it is they're sharing. But trying to be helpful and giving advice are really ways that we control other people. And advice actually shuts the conversation down and minimizes that quality of aliveness that we're searching for. And so we substitute curiosity for advice. We don't give people a call to action. We don't ask what they're going to do about it. We just urge participants in the group to ask others, why does that mean so much to you? Or tell me more about that. Asking curious questions so that we replace advice with curiosity. Next slide. So when people have accepted our invitation and they've decided to show up, there are 5 language actions that, when taken in the presence of others, create create the community that we're after and shift that connectedness and commitment and accountability. And these actions are to declare a possibility, to take ownership, I've created the world I live in, to say no authentically, to make a promise with no expectation of a return, and to declare the gifts we and others bring to the room. Each of these language actions or conversations is created through its own set of questions. The important thing about these conversations for possibility, ownership, dissent, commitments, and gifts is that they name the agenda that creates space for this alternative future, this alternative way of being together. The power's in the asking the questions, not in answering the questions. And the heart of the conversations is to create this sense of believing in and belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share your most authentic self with the world, as we talked about in the Brown definition of belonging. So these conversations don't require you to change who you are, they require you to be who you are and to bring who you are into the room in these conversations. So Beth Ellen.
Thanks, Anna. Next slide, please. So Anna talked a lot about questions, and I want to give you some examples of questions that don't have power or questions that have very little power, and then also look at some questions that do have power. And so I was wondering, I would love to see, Sunny, you were going to find a way to do this, you know, what people think about why these questions might not have might not be powerful questions, the questions that I put up here. So the first question is, how do we get people to be more committed? These are questions that we see or have all the time in meetings at work, or maybe in parenting, or in groups, or managing a client load. How do we get people to be more committed? How do we get people to be more responsible? How do we get them to do the right thing? How can they be more accountable? Can you tell me why these questions really don't have much power? And I'm not sure where I can see the writings, Sunny, if people are.
So to support the exercise that Beth has just shared with us, you can either chat your answers into the question pane on the GoToWebinar platform, or you can also use the chat function in the networking cafe. And as those answers roll in, I will share them on screen with Beth so that she can select some to address. So again, for everyone to locate the question pane on the GoToWebinar platform or on the networking cafe chat. Back to you, Beth.
Okay, thanks. So this is a question that is part of every organization. Where do we get the money? Or how do we negotiate for something? Why aren't those people in the room? What new policy will move our interests forward? In the slide that we looked at before about moving the context from where we are to a context of possibility of community, these are the questions that sort of keep us where we are, because there are things that we personally can't control, and we're trying to get people to do other things. Could you go to the next slide? I'm not seeing, has anybody commented, Sunny? Because if they are, I'm not seeing it.
We had one comment so far. Great statement from one of our participants saying that it's because you're assuming people are not committed when asking these questions.
Oh, that's a great point. Exactly. Assuming that we're making assumptions, right? We're making assumptions for people. So what's going to really make a powerful question is that it's ambiguous, it's uncomfortable, and Anna would say anxiety producing, and it's personal. And this allows us to get to answers that might not be popular. They might not be things that are going to they're not water cooler questions, right? They're questions that are really going to connect people and create a greater obligation to each other, because you are imbuing trust into the question. So why was it important for you to show up today? What would happen if you asked that in a meeting? I mean, if you have an environment where people are really committed to the community, they're going to answer with questions, with answers that are more meaningful than "it's my job," and it's going to create a conversation that is going to expand your community. So it's really important in meetings to really focus on questions before you have the meeting or the group session. The questions are so important, and they are more important than the answers. So Anna, and the next slide, please.
I was going to add to that question about why it was important for you to be here today. Because people have responded to an invitation, right? They had the option to say no. The answer to that question then is kind of personal and positive, right? They didn't just show up because it was their job. They showed up because they were invited and they wanted to respond to the invitation. So catching up a little bit here. So one of the conversations we mentioned is dissent. And so we make room for dissent when we're building the structure where belonging can happen, right? Creating space for dissent is how diversity gets valued. Inviting dissent into a conversation is how we show respect for a wide range of perspectives and beliefs. Anytime we care about a purpose or a place or a project, we're likely to have doubts and reservations. So a critical task of leadership is to protect space for the expression of people's doubts. And the key thing to remember here is that the doubts exist, right? All that we're doing is making space for them to come into the light, right? They're no longer secret doubts. They're out in the room. And this act of surfacing these doubts or this dissent, it doesn't change the communal intention to create some new alternative future. What is challenging is that we don't respond to people's doubts or dissent, right? That authentic dissent is complete in its expression. And when we think we have to answer people's doubts or defend ourselves or the project that we're working on or whatever, the space for dissent and authentic expression of doubt closes down. So when people have doubts and we attempt to answer their doubts, we're actually colluding with their reluctance to be accountable for their own new future. So all we have to do with the doubts of others is get interested in them. We don't have to take them on or let them resonate with our own doubts. We just get interested. And so we begin this conversation by allowing the people the space to say no. Because again, if we can't say no, then our yes doesn't really mean anything. So each of us needs a chance to express our doubts and reservations without having to justify them or move quickly into problem solving. No is actually the beginning of the conversation for commitment and accountability. So when dissent is truly valued and becomes the object of genuine curiosity, the chances of showing up as an owner in the organization grow dramatically. Next slide.
I think, Anna, that it's really hard as a leader to give space for dissent, you know, and it really requires of leaders to have that willingness to be vulnerable and hear that that not everything is okay. And sometimes it's really hard to hear that. And so creating that space for dissent is really important in leadership. And also when you're having groups, and it's important to create the advice-free zone to really promote curiosity. When a person gives advice to someone else, you're creating this dynamic in which one person has power and one person doesn't. And some people would say you're creating servitude. Some people would say that's the oppressor and the oppressed. That's a Paulo Freire perspective. And it's important that we're recognizing gifts. And so the way that you can create an advice-free zone is to ask questions like, why does that matter to you? What's important about this that you're telling me? Rather than saying, well, my experience was this, and keeping us stuck in the past. If we really, again, want to shift to the conversation about the future and a community of possibility, we really need to stay away from advice giving. Next slide, please.
And then, as we've mentioned, we focus on gifts. So to build belonging, rather than focusing on deficiencies and weaknesses, which most likely aren't going to go away, we gain more leverage when we focus on the gifts people bring and seek ways to capitalize on those. So instead of problematizing people and work, the conversation that searches for the mystery of our gifts brings the greatest change and results. The focus on gifts confronts people with their essential core and their freedom to choose to use their gifts or not. And that's what has the potential to make the difference and change lives for good, right? So our life work is to bring our gifts into the world. And this is a core quality of hospitable organizations who work to bring into play the gifts of all their members. So the gifts conversation boils down to our willingness to stop telling people about what they need to improve, what didn't go well, how they should do it differently next time. Instead, we talk about the gifts we've received from them or the unique strengths that we see in them, the capacities that they have to bring something unique and needed into the world, and so on. Next slide.
I think it's important to recognize in the gifts conversation or in language distinctions that that these conversations are happening in particular contexts in groups, because of course there are things that have to be done within organizations, but if the majority of your group time together is functioning under these structures of belonging, it will be easier to have those harder conversations. And so one of the things that we need to remember is to constantly be aware of looking at the distinctions between how things currently are and the future we're trying to create. And so if you look at these three questions, and I would love for you to, again, send some comments to Sunny about what the difference is between these three questions. Sunny?
Yeah, so for the participants, please feel free to use the questions in the GoToWebinar question pane and or the virtual cafe networking space chat as well. And we'll give just a minute or so for folks to provide their responses.
So I'm curious what you think the difference is between these three questions. How valuable an experience do you want to have, let's say, in this group meeting today? How valuable an experience do you think this will be today? How valuable an experience do you plan for this to be? And so for me, do we have any answers, Sunny? Any comments?
Not as of yet.
Okay. Well, have you ever gone to, I'll just wait, but I'll move on a little bit. Have you ever gone to a conference for CEOs like this one and felt that you're an expert, you know most of what is being said, and of course you are, because anyone coming to these conferences has already gone through school, has been educated, has achieved some kind of level of professionalism. And my dad, who used to go to these conferences a lot, always said to me, if I go to these conferences, even when he was at the end of his career, and my goal is to bring home one new thing. And he would go to conferences for 3 or 4 days, and just his goal was to bring home one thing. He was planning for the kind of experience that he was having. He was taking ownership of his experience. And that is really the difference between these three questions. He wasn't asking himself, how valuable, of an experience do I want it to be? He might have said, well, I know 99% of this stuff, so it's not going to be very valuable. And how valuable of experience do I want to have? And if he's just thinking, I'm just going to stay in my hotel room and do my work, and it's not I don't really want it to be valuable. It's different than how valuable do you think this experience is am I planning for this to be? And he planned for it, and he set an intention, and he created ownership over that. So using language that promotes ownership is really important. Using language that focuses on gifts, using language that allows for dissent. Those distinctions in our language are really going to matter in our group settings.
Beth, we have some excellent commentary that has just come in. So one of our participants identified that it allows for more buy-in in the information being presented. Another,
yes, that's good.
Another identified that the want in the first question equals a need, personal, and that the think in the second question implies possibility, anticipation, and the plan in the third question indicates action is expected to follow.
Right, so it's more future focused. Wow, those are great. Thank you.
Then,
I want to get those when we're done, Sunny.
absolutely.
And I think we're ready for the next slide.
So those questions that Beth Ellen just shared, the plan question that she just shared is one that we actually use when we do this work with organizations. We ask people early in the process, how valuable of an experience do you plan for this to be? And how much risk are you willing to take? Because those questions confront people with their freedom, right? And so they're free to tell us they plan for it to be an awful experience. But then they're very aware that they're choosing that, right? And so all the way through this process of engaging questions, we're helping people see that they are creating their reality and they have the choice to create a different reality. And so that process then allows whole authentic people to come into the room. So the last conversation that we do is the commitment conversation. And a commitment for our purposes is a promise made with no expectation of a return. So it doesn't require any approval or reciprocity from anyone. A promise that is contingent on what somebody else does is not a promise or a commitment, right? Wholehearted commitment makes a promise to peers about our contribution to the success of the whole. So it's a promise for the sake of a larger purpose, not for the sake of personal return. And promises are sacred. We use that language because there is kind of a sacredness behind I promise, right? These are the means by which we choose accountability. So we become accountable the moment we share our promise, our commitment to do the thing, no matter what anyone else does. So when I say, you know, I'm willing to use my gift to make sure that the whole effort is successful, right? Then I'm choosing to hold myself accountable for that because it's not contingent on anybody else or what they do. So again, we give permission for the unpopular answers here. So I'm not willing to make a commitment or a promise right now is an acceptable answer. It doesn't get you kicked out of the circle. It is an authentic expression. And again, we allow people to say no so that when they do say yes, it actually means something. So this is usually a really powerful wrap up to the time we spend together. People are making promises to each other about how they want to be together in the future and what they want to create together in the future. So Beth Ellen, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add, but that kind of brings us to the end. We're a little bit over our time anyway. So the end of how we create this structure of belonging. So I think we're ready for Q&A if there are questions.
Beth Ellen and Anna, thanks so much for that deep dive into how to really structure belonging. There's some great tactical, logistical, even room design components. Can you take us through a specific example of perhaps a client of yours that has worked closely or is relevant to the mental health and addictions provider field, and without naming any organizational names, kind of talk through the summary of change that occurred once they adopted the structure of belonging?
Sorry, I was on mute. Do you want to take that one, Anna?
I can start. We did work together several years ago on at an organization where there was a group of leaders who were really frustrated and struggling and questioning whether they remained committed to the organization or not, right? And so we brought this this work into a kind of a larger day of work that they were doing together, and we interspersed these small group conversations and questions into, I think we were there a couple of days actually. So over the course of a couple of days, we pulled people into small groups and asked them to imagine a possibility and declare a possibility of an alternative future, and then talk through, what were their doubts and reservations, and what promises were they willing to make to each other. And the end of this work, when we do it that intensely, is always really powerful, and it changed the culture of that group, and in some ways the culture of the whole organization, because of their kind of renewed commitment to the good of the whole, the good of their whole group, but the good of the whole organization, and their willingness to kind of keep pulling forward, pushing forward toward this possibility that they had named. So I don't know if that gets at your question, Sunny, or not, but that was the first thing I thought of.
Right. So there was a 2-day event, but then at every meeting that they had, they became over a period of years. It became, these questions and the formatting became part of who they were. And as new people came in, they participated in the culture. And it was because it was over time, and it was a continual commitment to a future possibility that they were able to transform, and everybody felt valued, and people were there because they wanted to be, instead of feeling like they had to be.
Yeah.
And it was a significant transformation.
Yeah, and they still end their meetings with a discussion of what gifts they've received from each other during the course of that meeting, just to acknowledge and help people recognize the ways that they benefit the group.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so powerful that you've been able to name these what seems to be micro changes, but really are granular incremental changes towards what becomes a new culture of being inclusive of voice. When we so often come together for a meeting, whoever leads that meeting is setting the tone, and then it's less of a inclusive interaction as it more so is that cult of personality, who's ever leading that meeting, right? And so you've given us such great structures today to say it's as important as looking at how we meet, and as we do our work, how we apply these standards, so that as we come together, anyone can lead based upon the clarity of how our meetings are formed, what our groups are doing, what the belonging looks like, so that there's no deference to a specific individual in a meeting, even if that is a person of a higher quote unquote authorization level, but an opportunity to join those voices together. I'm going to use the statement that one of our participants identified here. It's living with expectation in each experience.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Such a powerful statement.
Yeah.
We have just a few minutes left of our time together today. Ladies, thank you so much for being so specific on the work that you're doing, and being so intentional in both the micro ways of change that ultimately impact the way our organizations culturally do the work. And so any last insights or thoughts before we close together today?
I would like to just say that if you're struggling with the culture of an organization, that it really can change. And but it takes a huge commitment, but it really can change, and we've seen that, and it's pretty incredible, particularly in this space where in the helping space. So important.
Well, thank you for leaving us with those words of hope, but not just the words of hope, the actual details of how to make that cultural shift. So again, we thank Beth Ellen Holloman and Anna Schoen for their excellent support of exactly the tactical nature of how organizations can adapt and change, starting with something as simplistic and as beautifully articulated as the structure of belonging. As we close the session, we look to our last 30-minute break during our networking cafe, where additional learning topics and also videos have been uploaded for continuous learning. And then we'll join back together this afternoon at 3:30, where we will be meeting with the team at Exodus Refugee on connecting the path from war-related trauma to culturally competent services for refugees, asylees, and asylum seekers. Ladies of the Hive Collective, thank you again for your time. We will now end this session.